boring for them because they can come here and explain the same thing. But please bear with me, and let's go through this now, and tomorrow I'll repeat it, so that our Christian friends who were interested in that sort of thing will have the benefit of seeing that presented again, and you will have the opportunity to understand it more fully and to remember the information. When we talk about Isa alayhi salam, which we'll do more in depth tomorrow, and of course it's relevant now because when we think of da'wah, this is what comes up all of the time. So you have 4 Gospels, and this is the order in which they appear in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now the reason this is important is that for a long time, the way we did da'wah in using the Gospels is that we would often mention something, like we would mention that there is some proof that Isa alayhi salam has some weakness, and that means that he's not God. And when we do that, notice what happens. Our Christian friends quote something from the Gospel according to John, something that seems to indicate that Jesus somehow is a divine being. So it looks like we're never meeting together. We're quoting one thing that shows he has a weakness, and they're quoting something else that shows he's divine, and they're wondering, why doesn't the Muslim accept what we're saying? Because the Muslim seems to be quoting something from the Bible as if the Bible is acceptable. We're proving something using Bible verses, but they're proving another thing using Bible verses, and they can't understand why we are not accepting the other verses which they're quoting. But now, to make sense of all of this, you have to be able to see how the Gospels were written. So these are our 4 Gospels. This is how they appear. One opens the New Testament portion of the Christian Bible, and it begins with Matthew, then it goes to Mark, then it goes to Luke, then it goes to John. These are like 4 different biographies of the Prophet Isa alayhi salam. 4 different life accounts. Each one is called a Gospel. But the Quran only speaks of Gospel in the singular, Injil, right? Doesn't say Anajil, Injil. There's one Gospel that Allah taught Isa alayhi salam. And you can say that must have been what Isa alayhi salam taught others. Because since Allah taught him, it's for the purpose that he would teach others. But it may not have been a written document. But subsequent to his leaving the scene, these 4 documents were compiled, each one promising to be the Gospel. But they're different. And I won't have a chance to go into all of the details of how they're different, but you should see the literary relationship between them. So while this is the order, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, today scholars generally believe that Mark was actually written before Matthew. So the order should be like this: Mark, Matthew, and Luke, not necessarily in that order, and then finally John. So Matthew and Luke in between could be perhaps interchanged in this ordering, but what is almost certain is that Mark is first and John is last. And if you can remember that, and just keep that in the back of your mind, you don't have to do anything with it now. Whenever you're in discussion with somebody, you will notice that what you want to cite to prove to them that Isa alayhi salam is very much a human being and a prophet is Mark's Gospel. That's what you want to cite. And what they will often be citing in response is John's Gospel. And then you should be able to say then that you are quoting the one that was written the earliest, and they're quoting the one that was written last. And you can ask, what's the difference? Why is it that the one that was written first seems to represent Isa alayhi salam very much as a human being, and the one that's written last represents him as something that's so divine? So did he go from human to divine just in these documents from one to another? So you see the point now. See how important that is. So you have to remember that Mark is first, right? And to remember something, just associate it with something you know already, or something that even sounds silly, but it will be memorable. So just Mark, think. First you get on your mark, then you get set, and then you go. Okay? So first Mark. And you want to remember that John is the last of the 4, so I don't know how you remember that. Think of the song, Johnny Come Lately, New Kid in Town, something like that. Right? So John is the last of the 4. If you can remember Mark first, John last, you're way ahead of any discussion. Okay? So there is more to it than this. Not only was Mark said to be the first, I mean, now said by Christian biblical scholars to be the first. But they also realized that Matthew and Luke actually used Mark as their source, or one of their sources. So Matthew and Luke were actually copying the information from Mark as they went. Step by step, one episode for another. They're simply copying the information from Mark. But not, I said simply copying, but that's wrong. Not simply copying. They were copying, but not simply. They were copying, but modifying also the information as they went. So, you won't have occasion to do this, but if anyone were to go from Mark to Matthew and Luke, take the episode, see how it is in Mark, then go see how it is in Matthew and Luke, you will see that the image of Jesus is improved. He looks bigger and greater. His miracles are more powerful and more numerous, and so on. So, you can see that Jesus is growing before your very eyes. If he looks this tall in Mark, you know, he grows and he becomes this tall in Matthew and Luke. And finally, in John's Gospel, of course, he's going through the roof. Okay? Because that's a development until the Council of Nicaea, when he will be declared to be very God. And if we put some dates on this, we can see that Mark was written around 70 CE, Matthew and Luke around 85, and John around 100 as an approximation. That scholars say between 90 and 100. Some even say a little bit later, but we can use 100 as a rough approximation, and then you can see the development, you can see the changes as we go from 70 to 100. Now, if you ask where Jesus was in this whole scheme, Jesus would have been up here, about 30 CE would have been the date when he was taken up into heaven. And if you think of the Council of Nicaea, it's 325 somewhere down here. So these Gospels then are in the middle of that whole development of Christian ideas, and you can see the development from one gospel to another. I think this is an important thing for Muslims to know as they engage with others in dialogue and discussion about the nature of Isa alayhi salam and his position in the Islamic faith. All right? So I leave that thought with you, and I would be willing now to take any questions that you may have. Yes.
Thanks for your very clear and succinct presentation about the Gospels. Often what Christians will do, as you know, is say, but the Apostle Paul, who came even before any of the Gospels were written, testified to the divine being of Christ. So how would you, I have my own ideas about how you deal with that, but what would you recommend to dealing with this even earlier source about Jesus than any of the written Gospels when Christians bring up that one?
Yes. So we should say that the development was not a single straight line. There were many interconnections and many lines of development. Paul represents a very important line, important in that it will be formative for later Christianity. And that is also earlier than the written Gospels. To a certain extent, we should say that these Gospels almost follow Paul to a certain extent. Not only chronologically, but in terms of ideas. So the fact that Paul was earlier, and that represents an early development, does not contradict the observation that from one gospel to another you see this development. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned about not mentioning about how you're burning one another. But if you actually speak to the Christians that, quote them, the same reference from the Holy Quran, they say about, Jesus is different. He's not like any other human being. He's divine, and he died for our sin. Because once somebody's programmed, it's very difficult to deprogram.
Yes. Now, how might you respond to that?
Well, you see, like you said, they will not take the Quranic version. So, you either have to go to really extreme with them, but you can't because otherwise there'll be a massive argument.
Yes. But what you can do is not to quote the Quran to them, because if you quote the Quran to somebody who does not believe in the Quran, they will not accept it. That this is natural. But use logic, which is universal. Ask them about the logic of somebody dying for your sins.
Yes.
Why? Okay.
Yeah, I've discussed this on many occasions. But you see,